A pale winter sun rises over Rechlin Air Base. Frost clings to the wings of a captured American P-47 Thunderbolt, its silver skin scarred, its insignia hastily painted over with black crosses. The air smells of oil, cold steel, and anticipation. Mechanics move quietly, their breath misting in the frozen air. They have never seen a machine like this before. From the hangar, a Luftwaffe test pilot walks toward the aircraft. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche. His gloved hand brushes the fuselage, tracing the outline of foreign craftsmanship. He pauses, studying the wide wings and massive radial engine that had humiliated German fighters over Europe. As the propeller begins to spin, the silence breaks with a thunderous roar. Deep, alien, powerful. The ground trembles. German officers watch in uneasy fascination as the P-47 lifts off under a German flag. For a brief moment, by the spring of 1943, the sky over Europe had become a battlefield without borders. From the misty coastlines of France to the bomb-blasted fields of the Ruhr, the air thundered with engines, Allied bombers in endless formations, and German fighters scrambling to meet them. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp spear of the Reich, was now being forced into a war of attrition it was never built to sustain. Every dawn brought the same ritual: sirens, takeoffs, and the black trails of combat climbing into the stratosphere. American B-17s and B-24s came by the hundreds, escorted now by a new type of fighter, a massive, rugged machine that defied German expectations. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When it first appeared over occupied Europe, German pilots were stunned. It was huge, almost clumsy in appearance, yet it dived like a falling anvil and climbed with relentless power. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could take hits that would have torn a Messerschmitt apart, and still keep flying. In gun camera footage, Luftwaffe analysts watched in disbelief as P-47s absorbed cannon shells and escaped into cloud cover. The Luftwaffe's tactical problem was no longer just the numbers of Allied aircraft, it was the technology gap. The Thunderbolt and the later P-51 Mustang began to escort bombers all the way into the heart of Germany. The old defensive belts of the Reich, the flak corridors and fighter traps, began to fail. By late 1943, German air losses had reached levels that could not be replaced. Fuel shortages crippled training. Young pilots went into combat with less than 100 flight hours. Meanwhile, American factories rolled out new fighters every week. Inside the Luftwaffe's command structure, a grim realization settled in. To defeat the enemy, they had to understand him. Reports of captured Allied aircraft, forced landings, crash sites, abandoned runways began to trickle in. Orders went out to recover anything that could fly, or even be repaired. Intelligence officers from the Luftwaffe Erprobungsstelle, the Air Force Testing Service, scoured Western Europe for intact Allied planes. Each recovered aircraft was more than a trophy. It was a message from the future, a chance to see what German engineers were truly up against. Among the most coveted of these prizes was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine that embodied the industrial might of the United States and the changing nature of aerial warfare. Soon, one of these Thunderbolts would find its way to the secret heart of German aviation research, Rechlin. And there, the Reich would attempt to learn its enemy's secrets from the inside out. Hidden deep within the forests of Mecklenburg, far from the front lines, lay the Luftwaffe's most secretive airfield, Rechlin-Lerche, the beating heart of German flight experimentation. Established long before the war, Rechlin had evolved into the Third Reich's aeronautical brain, where every aircraft design, every captured enemy machine, and every daring flight test was studied in meticulous detail. To the outside world, Rechlin was just another base, but within its perimeter, fences stood the Luftwaffe's version of a future laboratory. Hangars filled with prototypes, wind tunnels, radar arrays, and elite test pilots who pushed the limits of what could fly. The base operated under silence and secrecy. Few outside the Air Ministry even knew its full scale. It was here that captured Allied aircraft were brought, often under cover of darkness. Some arrived in near ruin, salvaged from crash sites in France or the Netherlands. Others, more intact, had been forced down by mechanical failure or out-of-fuel landings during bomber escort missions. The Luftwaffe's recovery teams, nicknamed Bergungskommandos, moved swiftly, stripping insignias, photographing serial numbers, and transporting the remains by rail to Rechlin. Every piece of foreign technology was treated like a gold mine. Engineers disassembled engines, traced wiring systems, and studied armor plating. American metallurgy, British fuel systems, Soviet propeller designs. Each detail told a story of how the enemy built its machines. For German scientists, it was equal parts fascination and humiliation. Among these men were brilliant minds: Dr. Otto Behrens, Kurt Tank, and Voldemar Voigt, all racing to decode the secrets of their adversaries while developing jets and rocket planes of their own. Yet, within the corridors of Rechlin, rivalry was as fierce as innovation. Pilots argued with engineers. Designers defended pride over practicality. Each believed their aircraft. The Messerschmitt, the Focke-Wulf, the Heinkel held the key to regaining air superiority. Then came the P-47. When a largely intact Thunderbolt was recovered in 1944, it became an object of obsession. The Americans had built something radically different, heavy, yet incredibly resilient. Simple, yet sophisticated. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche stood on the frost-covered tarmac, staring at the P-47 Thunderbolt as though it were a living creature. For years, he had flown the pride of German engineering. The agile Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the rugged Focke-Wulf FW 190. Each was fast, responsive, and lethal in the right hands. Yet before him stood something utterly different. An aircraft that looked too heavy to fight, too bulky to survive a dogfight. And yet, somehow, it did. As Lerche climbed into the cockpit, he felt immediate disorientation. The controls were foreign, labeled in English. The dials were large, the layout logical but unfamiliar. Beneath him, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine rumbled with a deep, muscular sound, not the sharp whine of German inline engines. He adjusted his headset, steadied his breath, and eased the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt moved like a bull, slow to respond, but unstoppable once in motion. In the air, the differences were startling. Compared to the Bf 109, which felt like a rapier, light and twitchy, the P-47 was a warhammer. Its weight translated into stability. Its broad wings made it sluggish in the climb, but nearly invincible in a dive. Lerche noted that even when approaching terminal velocity, the Thunderbolt's controls remained responsive. German fighters, by contrast, often lost elevator authority beyond 500 miles per hour, a fatal weakness in high-speed pursuit. He pushed the throttle further, testing the supercharger. The aircraft climbed steadily, maintaining power at altitudes where the Bf 109's engine would have begun to gasp for oxygen. The American turbo supercharger system was a revelation, a masterpiece of engineering that allowed the P-47 to operate effectively at 30,000 feet, far above the reach of most German interceptors. Lerche's flight log from that day reads more like awe than analysis. He described the aircraft's immense fuel capacity, enough to cross Germany twice, and its ability to take punishment that would destroy any Luftwaffe fighter. The cockpit armor alone was nearly 2 centimeters thick, protecting the pilot like a steel cocoon. Tactically, he saw why Allied pilots had dominated the skies. The P-47's combination of speed in dive, power at altitude and range meant it could escort bombers deep into the Reich and still fight its way home. German fighters had to choose: attack the bombers or survive long enough to refuel. The Americans, flying their Thunderbolts, could do both. When Lerche landed, he knew the truth that few in Berlin wanted to hear. Germany's finest aircraft were masterpieces of precision, but they were fragile, limited, and over-engineered. The Americans had built a machine for war, not for art, and that realization would ripple through the Luftwaffe's leadership like a quiet thunder. When Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche's report reached Luftwaffe High Command, it caused more discomfort than pride. The findings were undeniable. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was not just strong, it was superior in endurance, survivability, and engineering simplicity. For a military built on the myth of technological supremacy, this was a hard truth to swallow. At the Reichsluftfahrtministerium in Berlin, engineers and officers gathered around Lerche's data sheets. His technical notes were thorough. Climb rates, dive limits, fuel consumption, engine behavior, and even the cockpit's ergonomic logic. He praised the Thunderbolt's rugged construction and criticized the Luftwaffe's obsession with lightweight perfection. "This aircraft," he wrote, "is built to fight a long war. Ours are built to win a single battle." Some senior officers dismissed his tone as defeatist. Others, especially within the technical branches, recognized the warning. The German aviation industry had become fragmented. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Heinkel competing for favor rather than cooperating. Each designer guarded secrets like a weapon. The Americans, in contrast, produced machines standardized for repair, mass production, and reliability, a concept alien to the German system, which still valued craftsmanship over quantity. Lerche's findings were shared with figures like Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, and Willy Messerschmitt himself. They studied his results, comparing them with their own performance charts. Discussions turned tense. Some argued the P-47's weight was a weakness in dogfighting, but Lerche countered. Dogfights were no longer the war's reality. The skies had become a vast battlefield of range and endurance, not agility. The Luftwaffe's intelligence section took a keen interest too. Analysts hoped Lerche's flights could expose the P-47's vulnerabilities for future encounters. But the more they studied, the fewer weaknesses they found. The aircraft's design philosophy, survivability first, performance second, was almost immune to the kind of tactical exploitation Germany had relied on since 1940. Behind closed doors, a quiet respect grew among engineers. They admired the Thunderbolt's sheer practicality. It represented something Germany's war machine had lost: the ability to think in terms of sustainment, not spectacle. In confidential memos, test officers even proposed adopting elements of the American design into future German models. The morning of the test was silent, heavy with fog. The P-47 stood at the edge of the Rechlin runway, its polished metal reflecting the pale light of dawn. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche moved methodically through his pre-flight checks, surrounded by a small circle of engineers and officers. Their notebooks were open, their expressions tense. No German pilot had ever taken an American Thunderbolt to its limits. Until now. Lerche climbed into the cockpit. The seat was higher than in any German fighter, offering an expansive field of vision. He closed the canopy, inhaled the unfamiliar scent of American oil and leather, and pressed the starter. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 came alive in a deep, throaty growl, a sound that seemed to shake the air itself. The vibrations coursed through the fuselage, heavier and steadier than anything he had felt before. Throttle forward. The Thunderbolt rolled down the runway with surprising steadiness. Its wide landing gear absorbed the rough concrete with ease. As the speed climbed, Lerche eased back, and the giant machine lifted effortlessly into the gray sky. At 3,000 meters, he began testing responsiveness. The controls were smooth, almost lazy. Not the quick, twitchy precision of a Messerschmitt, but forgiving, stable, and impossible to stall. He banked hard left, testing lateral load. The wings held firm. Then came the dive test. The moment every German pilot both dreaded and admired about the Thunderbolt. Lerche throttled back, nose down. The world tilted. The airspeed indicator began to spin. 600, 650, 700 kilometers per hour. The sound of the dive became a scream of compressed air. In a German fighter, this would be suicide. Compressibility would lock the controls, the wings would shudder, and metal fatigue could tear the aircraft apart. But here, in the P-47, the controls remained firm. The plane plunged faster than any Bf-109 or FW-190 could safely manage, yet stayed completely stable. At 800 kilometers per hour, Lerche pulled up. The airframe groaned but held. The G-forces pressed his body into the seat, but the aircraft responded. Obedient, controlled, and terrifyingly strong. He leveled out, heart pounding, knowing he had just touched the threshold of what human engineering could endure. Back on the ground, the mechanics inspected the airframe. Not a single crack or rivet loose. Lerche stepped out, helmet in hand, face pale but exhilarated. Unzerstörbar, he muttered. Indestructible. In his report, he wrote that the Thunderbolt's dive performance was beyond the limits of any current German fighter, and that its cooling system, turbocharger, and armor were of a technical logic unmatched by the Reich. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was an industrial philosophy in metal, and that terrified him more than any battle in the sky. Lerche's report reached Berlin within days. The document, marked Geheim, top secret, landed on the desks of the Luftwaffe's most powerful men, Ernst Udet's successors, the engineers of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, and senior officers of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. It was not merely a technical evaluation. It was an X-ray of Germany's failing air war. The findings stunned them. The P-47, Lerche explained, was not designed for brilliance. It was designed for survival. Its sheer bulk, once ridiculed, gave it a tactical advantage that no German fighter could replicate. It is a flying fortress in single-seat form, he wrote. Where our machines trade endurance for agility, theirs trade grace for dominance. Inside engineering circles, the response was both defensive and desperate. Willy Messerschmitt, always proud, dismissed the Thunderbolt as a tractor with wings. He insisted that speed and maneuverability were the essence of air combat. But Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, saw something more profound, a shift in the philosophy of aerial warfare. They are building for the long war, he said privately. We are still building for 1940. The divide grew wider as the Luftwaffe's situation worsened. The Allied bombing campaigns intensified, fuel became scarce, and replacement pilots arrived with minimal training. The P-47's massive range and firepower allowed it to escort bombers deep into German airspace, while German fighters, short on fuel and altitude performance, were forced into reactive defense. Lerche's data began circulating among design bureaus working on emergency programs. The TI-152, Me-262, and Do-335. Engineers tried to copy elements of the P-47's robustness, but the Reich no longer had the materials, manpower, or time. Aluminum was rationed, high-grade steel was gone, and factories were burning under Allied bombs. By the spring of 1945, Rechlin Air Base, once the pride of the Luftwaffe's experimental program, was no longer a fortress of innovation. Allied bombers had found it, burned it, and broken it. The hangars that once housed the future of German aviation now stood gutted, littered with the twisted remains of prototypes and captured aircraft. The sound of engines had been replaced by the quiet whistle of the wind across shattered glass. Hans-Werner Lerche survived. Unlike many of his fellow test pilots, he was never captured in combat. Until the final days of the war, he continued flying whatever machines still functioned, German or foreign, recording data that few would ever read. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed in, Lerche and several engineers abandoned Rechlin, driving west toward the American lines. He carried with him his flight logs, detailed notes, and photographs of every aircraft he had tested, including the P-47. When the Allies finally occupied Rechlin, what they discovered astonished them. Inside the damaged hangars were rows of foreign aircraft, Spitfires, Mustangs, P-38s, even Soviet Yakovlev fighters, all meticulously labeled and studied. German engineers had treated their enemies' machines not as trophies, but as teachers. American and British intelligence officers spent weeks cataloging the wreckage. Many of the reports written at Rechlin were later translated and archived in Allied research centers. Lerche himself surrendered to U.S. forces. He was interrogated, then quietly debriefed. His calm, technical manner impressed his captors. They were surprised by the depth of his knowledge, not just of German aircraft, but of Allied ones as well. After the war, he contributed to aviation studies under Allied supervision, his expertise seen as valuable for the coming jet age. Yet, much of what he had learned at Rechlin was already obsolete. The propeller war was over. The era of jet propulsion had begun. The Me-262, Germany's revolutionary jet fighter, had arrived too late to change the outcome. The lessons Lerche and his peers uncovered from the Thunderbolt would become a footnote in a war already decided by industrial scale and fuel supply. Still, among those who studied Rechlin's ruins, one truth stood clear: Germany had learned too late what its enemy had mastered early. Durability, simplicity, and standardization win wars. And within the silent hangars of Rechlin, the remains of that lesson lay scattered in aluminum and ash. In the years following the war, the legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt only grew stronger. To the Allies, it was already a symbol of unstoppable endurance. A fighter that could dive faster than any other, absorb enemy fire, and still return home. But among those who had once worn the Luftwaffe's eagle, the Thunderbolt carried a different legacy. It represented the bitter acknowledgement that the Reich had underestimated its enemies. Lerche's flight reports, recovered and translated by Allied intelligence, revealed more than technical curiosity. They showed admiration. His descriptions of the P-47's power, stability, and high-speed performance were almost poetic. Where German fighters relied on precision and agility, the Thunderbolt triumphed through brute strength and clever engineering. It was the first time many German engineers realized that raw horsepower, reliability, and range could outweigh fine-tuned aerodynamics. These revelations influenced post-war design philosophies on both sides. In the West, the U.S. Air Force took note of how the Thunderbolt's rugged design philosophy could evolve into jet aircraft that were both durable and powerful, traits that later appeared in the F-84 Thunderjet and F-86 Sabre. Meanwhile, in the East, captured German documents, including those from Rechlin, guided Soviet research. The Cold War's earliest jet fighters carried, in their blueprints, lessons learned from that very exchange of wartime technology. For Germany, the ruins of Rechlin became a ghost site. In the post-war years, its hangars served as silent witnesses to the brilliance and tragedy of German aviation. Engineers who once designed weapons of war were absorbed into Allied projects, from Operation Paperclip in the U.S. to Soviet technical institutes. Their experiences with the Thunderbolt and other Allied aircraft became case studies in humility. How innovation thrives not only on genius, but on resources, teamwork, and production power. Hans-Werner Lerche lived quietly after the war, later writing his memoir, Test Pilot der Deutschen Luftwaffe. In its pages, he described the P war, for all its horror, has always been a strange teacher. Beneath the smoke and chaos, it forges discoveries, not through peace or cooperation, but through desperation. At Rechlin, that truth was written in metal and fire. A German pilot learned from an American machine. Engineers who once saw the world as divided by ideology were forced to confront a simple fact. Excellence knows no nation. Hans-Werner Lerche's test flight was more than an act of espionage or analysis. It was an unintentional bridge between enemies. In the roar of the P-47's engine, he glimpsed the future. A future where technology would move faster than the flags painted on its wings. The paradox was cruel. Destruction had become the engine of innovation. Decades later, the airfield lies quiet. The wind moves through the skeletal remains of hangars where thunder once lived. The same sky stretches above, empty, endless, and indifferent. Somewhere beneath it, fragments of aluminum still glint in the grass. Relics of a time when men risked everything to understand what their enemies had built. War ends, empires fall, but knowledge, even born from conflict, survives. And in that survival lies humanity's one redeeming gift: the will to learn.